service, and it's going to be moderated by none other than John himself. And I am so excited because John brought with him tonight his own personal director's chair. Now let me show you something. This was given to him by members of his home group when they thought he was going to be moving out of the area. See, it's got his name on it, you know. He's in charge. He's in charge. And when he got this, he didn't move. Okay. So, John, take over.
Thank you very much. It feels so good. Feel right at home. Thanks very much, and welcome to Saturday night of your life. You know, we've been talking for the last couple 3 days, basically about recovery. We've focused an awful lot on our big book and our 12 and 12, and then last night, Frank, as only Frank can, brought to life those 12 traditions along with some of the history of AA, bringing us to understand and hopefully appreciate how we hang together and how important unity is to us. Now, tonight, we're going to talk about the 3 legacies of Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, the 12 steps are the first legacy, which represent recovery. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, we know that an alcoholic doesn't do too well with anything else unless he gets into the recovery process. Traditions don't mean anything to him, naturally, and he's not really concerned about unity at that stage of his early beginnings. And we have discovered that, and as you have discovered, I'm sure, that if you want to be a well-rounded member of Alcoholics Anonymous, there's more than just the steps. There's more than just the first and 12th steps. There's more than just the first 3 steps. There is recovery, unity, and service. That is the total picture of Alcoholics Anonymous. And if one would take the opportunity to avail himself to inserting the 36 principles we're going to talk briefly about tonight into his life, he's going to come up with something that is used by Bill Wilson in one of his writings, and Frank brought it to our attention a couple of 3 years ago. It's something we call emotional sobriety. You know, sobriety, as Wesley used to describe it, is to not be under the influence of. And you remember last night that Frank mentioned that as a society, we can be, you know, we could get off base, and as individuals, we can get off base. I could be drunken. You've heard the saying, power drunk, drunken for power, or if I get into a mode where I think money is more important than anything else, I can get less than sober about that. And so sobriety is to not be under the influence of. And when you're not under the influence of emotions, which can drive us up a wall, and you have an even keel where you're not way up and way down, you have what we call emotional sobriety. And we're going to talk about how to get to that. First thing we're going to do is talk about, just very briefly, we're going to summarize the first 2 legacies, and then we're going to get into the 3rd legacy. And the panel that we have tonight, this distinguished-looking panel that is here with us tonight, they're going to very briefly describe the legacies. They've all been assigned 3 each. I mean, it works out that way. If you can, you know, we took us about 30 minutes to figure that out tonight. That's why we were late for dinner. But we haven't had a chance to do this that often, but we think it's important, and we think you'll see something. Charlie brought it to my attention, and I don't know who brought it to his attention. He may have been smart enough to figure it out. I don't know. But he's the first one that brought it to my attention that there seemed to be some sort of a rhythm to Bill's writings. It seemed like he, in the 12 steps, he presented us in the first proposition with what the problem was. Powerlessness over alcohol, unmanageable life. Then you see in the second proposition a solution to that. And then steps 3 through 9 are a program designed to bring about sobriety. And then 10, 11, and 12 are a continuation of that, and you will find that the 12th proposition of the steps gives us a reward, a spiritual awakening. And then we find basically the same thing, and I think Frank alluded to it last night, that in the first tradition we find the problem stated. We developed, and the traditions evolved because we found out we could get sober, but we weren't so sure we could live with each other. So unity was the crux. And so the first proposition in the 12 traditions talk about the main problem, which is unity. And then the second tradition speaks to the authority in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the solution to how we stay unified. We don't make decisions. I don't decide. We have no one in authority. We don't have a CEO. It's God as He expresses Himself. And then we find that in the traditions, traditions 3 through 11, we take a position on things which will drive us apart, like membership, autonomy, etc., etc. And if we can all agree that we won't get into a dispute about these things, then we won't have anything to argue about. And if we do that, this is what we call non-action steps. The 12 steps are action. We take action to bring about a result. The 12 traditions, we take a position of non-action to bring about a result. And in the 12 traditions, that result is a spiritual anonymity, where we're willing to give of ourselves 100% without expecting anything in return. And then we'll find the same rhythm applies in the 12 concepts. And when we get to that point, Charlie's going to give us a little brief history of the 12 concepts. Charlie or Frank, I haven't decided. I mean, they haven't decided which ones yet. But we're going to briefly go through the 12 steps. I'm going to put them on the overhead up here and ask the first. We've got them assigned. Now, you watch how this works. We're very clever. The first one is going to be Willie.
Number 1 states our problems. We admitted we were powerless. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, and our lives had become unmanageable. This is our admission of powerlessness, and this is our first step towards liberation.
Now the solution, Frank.
Solution step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity.
Now we begin the action. Charlie? Or Joe, I'm sorry. Joe changed the steps tonight.
Don't leave me out. The next step is step 3, the decision. I made a decision to turn our will and our lives to the care of God as we understood Him. And this decision is based on the first 2 steps.
4, Charlie?
If number 1 was the problem, powerless. If number 2 was the solution, power. And if number 3 was a decision between those 2, then number 4 is an inventory of ourselves, which would block us off from that power or that God as we understand Him.
Willie, admission.
We admitted to God and to ourselves and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs.
Frank.
Step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character.
Joe.
Step 7, humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings.
Charlie.
In that inventory we took in 4, we found those things that blocked us off from God. We talked about them to another human being in 5. We became willing to get rid of them in 6. We asked God to take them away in 7. And then we are right in the first 2 dimensions of life, right with the spirit and right with the mind. Now then, we reach out to other people and we begin to get right in the 3rd dimension, a physical, sociological relationship with the world and the people in it. And we do that by the list of people we have harmed, which we picked up from step 4, and we become willing to make amends to these people so we can get rid of that guilt, remorse, fear associated with them.
After we make the list, then there's an exercise, and it's step 9.
We made a direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others, and this is our second attempt to straighten up with our fellow human beings.
And then recovery should be in place. And then the next proposition says that we will continue to do everything we've done up to this time. Frank?
Step 10. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it.
And then, of course, we'll want to continue to improve our conscious relationship with the God of our understanding, and that is step 11. Joe?
Step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out.
And now, excuse me.
This step really is once we can accomplish the other steps, then we can receive God's power in our lives. So obviously, this is a culmination of the spiritual experience.
Excuse me, Joe. And now Charlie's going to summarize and what these steps will, the results of the first 11 propositions.
Oh, yes, 11.
Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. As we practice step 3 through 11, doing the action called for in the steps, we have had a personality change. Old defects and old ideas are cast aside, replaced with a new set, and because of the new way of thinking, we're able to feel, believe, and do things we could never do before. And one of the most important of those is to be able to stay sober with some peace of mind, serenity, and happiness. So the result of the actions taken in the steps will be that spiritual awakening. And now that we've got the result, then those that have had it can then carry the message of it to those who haven't had it and help them come to believe and help them decide and help them take their action so they can also have a spiritual awakening. And then when we find out how well these principles have worked in our life, we then become willing to practice them in all our affairs, and we begin to really get well in everything, not just alcoholism. The result, a spiritual awakening from the action steps.
So we see that rhythm. Problem, solution, action, bringing about a result called a spiritual awakening. Okay, so then the individual begins to get well, and even in the middle of that, even before he's at that place of spiritual awakening, it's possible for him to get into the second legacy, having to do with unity. And I'm not going to rehash all of that good work that Frank did last night, but we're going to now just go through the 12 traditions, and we're going to see and talk about that same rhythm and see if you don't agree that there seems to be a rhythm in this writing. The first tradition talks about the problem, and Willie's going to give us that one.
All right, our problem is our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity because, without unity, AA will die.
Okay, and then Frank, what is the solution?
The solutions. Tradition 2, for our group purpose, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God, as He may express Himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants, they do not govern. Sole authority in AA is a loving God, as He may express Himself in the group conscience. Rotating committees are servants of the group.
So now we have the problem defined and the solution defined, and then the traditions take those issues that we found early in our fellowship in the early 1940s, those problem areas, and how could we state and take a position so that we could not have anything to argue about. We found that there were several problem areas. One, the first one that they talked about is membership, and Joe's going to tell us about that issue.
Tradition 3, the only requirement for AA membership is the desire to stop drinking. And as John said, the steps, we had actions to take. In the traditions, these are actions we do not take. So there should be no discussion in the group about membership, because the only requirement is membership and desire to stop drinking. Before this tradition was in fact one of the problems within the groups, and these traditions did come about as a result of the problems that existed at that time. One of the great things that tore the group apart and brought about the disunity was the discussion of who could be a member in Alcoholics Anonymous. All different groups had all different kinds of lists of memberships, and this brought a lot of arguments. I usually get in trouble talking about this tradition. You know, they had all kind of rules about, you know, if you got drunk, you couldn't get back in the group. They had rules about who could be a member and how long you had to stay out after you got drunk. And then one group had one rule and another rule. And this the one I get in trouble with Willie all about. They had a special rule about fallen women. You know, if you was a fallen woman, you couldn't get into the group. So really, this brought about a lot of argument. And finally, we said the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. And if this is the only requirement, then there can be no arguments in the group on this particular subject if we practice this tradition.
Thank you, Joe. So we see that we had an experience before we had the tradition. Yeah. And the experience was that groups did have membership regulations or protective regulations, which tended to drive everybody out. And if we can all agree that the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking, then we don't have anything to argue about. It's a done deal. Then we come to the right of a group to govern itself. Charlie?
The last time we did this, and Joe did that particular tradition, he said that fallen women could not be a member of the fellowship. And he turned to Willie and said Willie could not have been a member. Made her madder than hell, too. Tradition 4 says that each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. And I think what that really means is each group, based upon its own group conscience, can do practically anything they want to, providing it will not affect another group or AA as a whole. The question is always asked, well, when will it affect another group or AA as a whole? My usual answer is, if you're breaking a tradition in your group, then you are probably going to affect another group or AA as a whole. But other than breaking traditions, you're free to do about anything you want. If you want to hold meetings at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, that's great. If you want to hold them at 1 o'clock in the morning, that's fine. If you want to have a group discussion, that's okay. If you want to have a big book study, that's all right. If you want a meeting to be 30 minutes, that's fine. If you want it to be 2.5 hours, that's okay. If you want to come naked, that's all right, too. Providing the group conscience agrees with that. And what it's really saying is that no group in AA has the right to tell another group what they can do, nor even bitch about it, providing it is not affecting another group or AA as a whole. No controversy in this area.
All right. And now Willie will tell us about the primary purpose.
Each group has but one primary purpose, just one, to carry its message to alcoholics who still suffer. And the old adage about, better do one thing well than many badly. The ability of each AA to identify himself with and to bring recovery to the newcomer is a gift from God. Passing on this gift to others is our one aim. Sobriety can't be kept unless it's given away.
So, if we are in agreement about membership, if we're in agreement about a group's autonomy, and if we agree that we only exist for one thing, and then what is another area that we might have problems with so that we won't be arguing? Joe? Or Frank, I'm sorry. Frank.
Tradition 6.
No.
An AA group ought never to endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to a related facility or outside enterprise, lest the problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. Experience proved that we could not endorse any related enterprise, no matter how good. We could not be all things to all men. We saw that we could not lend the AA name to any outside activity.
Thank you, Frank. Now, how are we going to finance ourselves? Money's always a problem. There's some writings in our literature that says that there's 3 things that'll mess up people faster than anything else, and one of them is money. The other's power and the other's prestige. So what can Alcoholics Anonymous or a group of alcoholics, what position can we take with respect to money so that we don't have anything to argue about? That would be Joe.
Tradition 7. Every AA group ought to be fully supported declaring outside contributions. I think that this is one thing that could bring about controversy in the group if we took outside contributions. We would have to be able to argument in the group whose money we're going to take and associate it with different things. And different people in the group would have different opinions, and that would bring about controversy. But since we receive no contributions from any outside organizations, there should be no controversy within the group on it if we practice this tradition.
But does that mean we don't have controversy about money? No. But where do we go to resolve the issue? We go back to our traditions. So, now Charlie's going to tell us about, there's no paid professionals in Alcoholics Anonymous.
At the beginning of our Big Book study on Thursday, John was talking about the history, and Joe and I approached some of the history. We talked about the time they met in 1937 and made the 3 decisions in Akron. One was to build a chain of hospitals. One was to hire a group of professionals to carry this message, and the other one was to write the Big Book. And we said at that time we were very grateful that only one of the 3 came true, the writing of the book itself. In the beginning, they intended to hire, train, and pay people to do this on a professional basis. Thank God Mr. Rockefeller and other people didn't give them the money to do that with, because they very rapidly found out that the greatest thing we got going for us, period, is one drunk giving of his time to another drunk freely, expecting nothing back in return. And if there's anything that'll get a cynical drunk, man or woman, is to give it to them and expect nothing back in return. And that's probably been one of the greatest things that's happened to us. We have never had a paid professional in AA, and if we stay with our traditions, we will never have a paid professional in AA. We do not pay for doing 12-step work, nor should we accept money for doing 12-step work.
While you're on that subject, let me just clear up something that I have heard once or twice, not only here but elsewhere. There is sometimes the notion that Charlie and Joe get paid to do these studies. And as I was giving them their expense checks today, I said to one or two of them, I said, we'll probably start another rumor now that I'm paying your expenses. But we do that in the seminar, and all the other seminars that are held do it the same way. We handle these folks coming into town just like we handle them coming into town. We're expected to pay their expenses to get here. We take care of them when they're here, and we send them back home. But they don't get paid to come here and do this seminar. So if you hear that rumor, I can't imagine anybody starting it, but it does get started. These guys would not do what they do if money was involved with it. I guarantee you that much. I know I wouldn't have anything to do with it, and I know these guys well enough. I'm almost insulted every now and then when somebody comes up to me and says, well, I hear these guys get paid to come down here and do that. Not true. Not true. And then, now that I've opened up that,
Since Joe and I don't get paid, does that mean Willie and Frank does?
well,
You noticed I got awful quiet.
well, I hadn't started any rumors about them two yet. We'll take care of that when it comes up. And now, here's one that, it ought to be almost understood. Alcoholics being organized. Can you imagine that? So we take a position on it. Willie, what is that?
That we can't organize a one-car funeral. That's that. Okay, where am I? Oh, no.
We're going to have fun tonight.
Yeah, we're having a good time. AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. These are special service boards and committees. The General Service Conference, the Board of Trustees, group committees cannot issue directives to AA members or groups. And I often heard when I first came in, they used the expression a lot that Alcoholics Anonymous was the most disorganized organization in the world. And that's the way it should stay. That'll keep us from getting so structured that, there's rules and edicts and orders, because we wouldn't pay them any mind anyhow, would we?
Another saying that makes me understand that they say that a camel is a horse put together by an AA committee. It's a done deal. Okay, now, we don't take issue with anything other than alcoholism. We don't even take issue with that. And so this is a tradition that keeps us in the boundaries. Frank?
Tradition 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues. Hence, the AA name ought never to be drawn into public controversy. AA does not take sides in any public controversy. Reluctance to fight is not a special virtue. Survival and spread of AA are primary aims. Lessons learned from the Washingtonian movement.
And you mentioned those last night beautifully. Now, public relations has always been important. We've always had to deal with public relations, and they have been our greatest asset. But we've taken a position on it based on experiences that we've had earlier, which is pretty clear. Tells us about where we maintain anonymity, not here amongst ourselves, but at another level. And that's going to be told to us by Joe.
11. Our public relation policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We feel always to maintain personal anonymity level of press, radio, and films. And this has to deal with our public relation, our anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films, that we remain our public relation be on attraction rather than promotion. And this is a tradition that is practiced by the group will keep down a lot of controversy, because I'm sure if our group had an opportunity to go on TV and who was going to do it would be quite a big argument in the group, and there'd be controversy among us. Well, since none of us can do that, there is no discussion in the group about this. One of the things that has nothing to do with the tradition, and they mentioned it, and I think it was back up here on someone else's traditions, talks about we do not raise money. I think I always feel good today when we look across the country and look on our TVs and see all the people raising money and promoting for this cause and that cause, to do this and do that. I think one thing that makes me proud to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and for over 50 years, Alcoholics Anonymous has performed a service for this country and millions of people in this country, and we have never asked the general public for one penny. We take care of ourselves.
Very good, Joe. Thanks. Now,
providing each group is self-supporting to its own contributions.
Now, all of this non-action brings about a result, and Charlie's going to tell us about that.
The result of the non-action that we took or did not take in traditions 3 through 11 will be the 12th tradition, which is a different kind of anonymity than what Joe's talking about. In tradition 11, the anonymity deals there with revealing our names, revealing our membership in AA at the level of press, radio, and film. But that's dealing with membership and names. Tradition 12 deals with what is referred to as spiritual anonymity. And in spiritual anonymity, you have people who are in a position where none is above the other. This is why we have an anonymous fellowship, for one thing. Spiritual anonymity is where all people are willing to sacrifice their own wants, desires, and needs for the good of the whole. Spiritual anonymity is where 100 people would put a book together and none claim authorship for themselves. Spiritual anonymity is self-sacrifice, true humility. And I think we can see that if we followed traditions 3 through 11, we would most certainly be practicing self-sacrifice. Because many of us would want to limit membership in AA on a personal basis. Many of us would want to get money from outside sources. Many of us would want to do things other than just carry this message to the alcoholic that still suffers. And in order for us to follow our traditions in our group, it requires spiritual sacrifice on each individual member of the group. Therefore, the 12th tradition summarizes the other traditions by giving us of the non-practicing or the non-action in tradition 3 through 11, spiritual anonymity. Had a fellow not too long ago, he was so concerned about people would know he was in AA. He wanted us to ensure him 100% that we would not reveal his identity and let anybody know he was in AA. And I said, you really don't need to worry too much about that, because we don't want anybody to know you're in AA either.
Touché. And you know, as Charlie was speaking, the story that Bill shared with us in the first tradition about Eddie Rickenbacker is a perfect example and a microcosm of how we in AA should be. Those guys who were on that raft, who survived that crash of the airplane like we survive our alcoholism to get here, but we're still floating on a shaky sea. Those 9 guys had to give of each other. They had to support one another and give of their petty wishes and desires. None could drink more water than the next. None could eat more food than the next. They all had to pull together. And what they had was a result. They survived many weeks out there on that sea. So that's a beautiful story, and it points out the real need for traditions in Alcoholics Anonymous, because that's where we are. Frank mentioned last night the pressures that Alcoholics Anonymous is under today, the erosion from without, and there are those within who think that anonymity is outdated and that membership and primary purpose is outdated. But we have experience that tells us that they're not. So that brings us to the next list of 12. We found that we had a set of steps that could keep us sober, a set of traditions that could allow us to live with each other. And then some things began to happen in 1940 with our co-founders that brought about a need for our third legacy. And Charlie has graciously consented this evening just so much to tell us a little of the background and the history of how the concepts and how Bill knew that he and Dr. Bob had to turn this fellowship over to you and I so that we could live in perpetuity, so that we could be here forever. And Charlie's going to tell us about that now.
If I'm going to do it, I ought to make him get out of that damn director's chair and let me sit in it.
What are you doing, Charlie? He's real serious.
I thought you would get it. You can stay over here and you can run the slide. You can do the pony show. I'll do the dog show.
We want John to keep his humility.
Hey, that fits pretty good. Most people in AA are not overly concerned with this thing called service work. I guess maybe we're fortunate that not everybody wants to be a part of the service structure, because if everybody did, there probably would not be room enough for everybody to work. Most people are not too overly concerned about the concept, because they feel that probably those have to do with the politics of AA, and they're not concerned with anything above the group level. But I think if we would go back and just for a little bit and look at some of the history behind the need for the service structure, And for the concepts, we would begin to see that they may really be interesting to us. And we may begin to see where each of us as individuals need to know at least what they're for and a little bit about them, whether we ever participate in that area or not. And as we've been studying our history over the weekend, and I think we're so fortunate to be able to do this, to be able to go back to our literature, to be able to have Frank with us from archives, to be able to continually remind ourselves where we came from. Well, if we forget where we came from, we're probably going to forget where we're going. And if we do that, we'll probably end up lost somewhere out there, wherever that might be. And I think this kind of weekend is one of the favorites that I have anywhere that we go, because it does take us back, and it does remind us, and it does let us know how precious this thing is that we have. And I think we're the luckiest people in the world. Now, most of those people out there are sicker than hell, and they don't have any program of recovery. Most of those people out there don't have these things called traditions to be able to live with each other by. And most of those people out there don't have such a thing as a service structure and concepts to protect them in the future. I think we alcoholics should certainly number among the luckiest people in the world. And anytime I fool and talk with these three legacies, I usually become emotional. And I like to use the word awe, because when something completely confounds me, that's the only word I can think of. And I always stand in awe of these three legacies. Because we had an old broken down, beat up New York City stockbroker that wrote the first legacy and put it in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the most spiritual pieces of information that the world has ever seen. Yet he knew nothing about spirituality. I heard a fellow say the other day that he felt that the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous was probably the greatest social happening of this century. I heard another fellow say to a guy named Henry Kissinger, "Henry, what do you think is the greatest thing ever happened in this century?" And Henry, without a bat of an eyeball, said, "Alcoholics Anonymous, undoubtedly." And probably we have touched and will touch as many people through this thing as anything else will. And an old drunk who knew nothing about spirituality left a very spiritual book. I stand in awe of the fact that a bunch of drunks could get together, and as much as we love to fight, as much as we love to force our will on other people, as much as we love to have our way, and as much as we always know that we're right and the other one's wrong, it amazes me how we could ever have come up with these things like the tradition that has managed to hold this fellowship together. You see, we do love to fight. You can see it in a group. All you got to do is just say politics, and the damn fight's on. Or you just say religion, and the fight's on. Or you say one or two words, and away we go. Thank God we were able to find those traditions. And again, a fellow who was a power driver, who had always been a loner, who always dominated other people, who all of his life had wanted and had his own way, was able to come up with this other set of spiritual principles called the traditions that would allow us to live together in peace and harmony. Bill Wilson didn't have that kind of knowledge, no more than he had the knowledge to write that spiritual book. Surely, surely, some power greater than human power had to guide him in those efforts. And as we've been looking at those first two, and John's been talking about emotional sobriety, it's pretty easy to get dry sobriety. It's not very hard to get sober. All you have to do is walk up and slap the hell out of a policeman, and you're going to get sober in a hurry. Emotional sobriety is that sobriety that you have and that you're happy with it, and that you're not constantly worried, and you're not constantly afraid, and that you feel at peace with yourself and your fellow man and your God as you understand Him. And surely by now we can see that that really is the purpose of the 12 steps. Not so much to be sober, but to develop emotional sobriety. Because if we wasn't happy with our sobriety, I know what we would do. Sooner or later we would go back to drinking. It's also been said that we can get just as drunk collectively, dry drunk, as we can individually. And I've seen AA groups go just as crazy collectively as I've ever seen any individual go crazy. And if we would follow these traditions as we've looked at them, there's really nothing left for us to go crazy about. How many times have I seen the fight start and some older AA member pull out the traditions and say, let's look at tradition 6 and see what it says. And immediately the fight's over with. How many times have they pulled it out and said, let's look at 3 and see whether she can be a member or not. And immediately the fight's over with. Because when we follow our traditions, there can be no controversy. And if there's no controversy within the group, then we have emotional sobriety in the group. And individual sobriety can exist where you have emotional sobriety. The one thing that hasn't been mentioned tonight is the triangle. And there really are 3 sides to the triangle. And the base of it is the recovery. That has to come first. Because if we're not emotionally stable in our own individual lives, then we cannot be emotionally stable together. And unless we've had recovery, then you can forget traditions. Because we're not about to follow them unless we can practice spiritual anonymity. And without recovery, you can't practice it. So the base of the triangle is recovery, and then one side of it will be the traditions, the unity for our fellowship. I don't think there's any fellowship in the world that guards the rights of the individual member as much as AA does. But when it comes to the rights of the group as a whole, that must always take precedence over the rights of the individual. And there has been times in the past when we've had to sacrifice the individual. When we've had to say, you don't belong here. When we've had to say, you need to go to another fellowship. When we've had to say, you're disrupting our meeting, you will have to leave. And the only time we ever do that is when it threatens the group itself. But the group is as important to us as our individual sobriety, because without the group, there will be no individual sobriety. Now, we need the power of the fellowship as well as the power of the spiritual experience. Now, in 1937, when the big book was written and that first legacy was coming out, and it was printed in 1939, it became apparent that AA was going to have money, not as much as they thought, but it was apparent that somebody would need to operate the business. And the individual members at that time did not want to get involved in the business of operating a business. They just wanted to try to stay sober. So they set up a little alcohol foundation, primarily in the beginning to handle the business to be generated by the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And this little foundation was incorporated in the state of New York. And it was necessary that it be incorporated because the time would come when they would have to hire perhaps a secretary, when they may have to pay an accountant some money for doing book work, when they would have bills coming in for printing and things like that. So it had to become a legal entity to do so. Now, the individual members at that time did not want nor could they meet together all the times necessary to conduct that business. So they gave the right to represent them to Bill and Bob, and maybe one other alcoholic on that board of trustees of that little foundation. And Bill and Bob, being the co-founders, willingly took the responsibility to conduct AA's business, so that the groups could concentrate on one thing and one thing only, and that's sobriety. And as the years went by, and as the big book began to sell, and as the money began to come in, as the groups began to proliferate around the country, as the membership began to climb, the business became bigger and bigger and bigger. Just like the problems between the groups that call for unity became bigger and bigger and bigger. About the time they begin to be concerned about traditions, they also begin to be concerned about who will someday take care of AA's business. Because sooner or later the co-founders are going to die, and who and what and how are they going to be replaced to take care of AA's business? And about the time they really got to thinking about this and began to get these traditions worked out, Dr. Bob did become ill. And he became ill with another incurable disease or a terminal illness. And it became apparent that he wasn't going to live very much longer. They wanted to get not only the traditions approved before Dr. Bob died, but they wanted to get some kind of vehicle approved whereby the transference for the responsibility of AA could be made from the co-founders back to the fellowship itself. And Bill wanted it done before Dr. Bob died. Because they knew if he waited till after Dr. Bob died and then tried to make changes, certain members of the fellowship would simply say, now then, Bill's doing it his own way. And he waited till Bob died to do that. I can't imagine any of us doing that kind of thing, but surely some of us would say so. So at the same time the traditions were being developed and written and looked at and hashed out and discussed and cussed, Bill and another fellow named Bernard Smith, and probably one or two more, and by the way, Bernard was a non-alcoholic on this trustees board, began to start thinking about putting together this service structure. In 1950, in Cleveland, Ohio, at the first International AA Convention, the traditions were presented to the fellowship that was there at that time as the second legacy of Alcoholics Anonymous. A loving God expressing himself through the group conscience accepted those traditions, and they have remained the same ever since. Also at this convention, Bill and Bob and some of the others presented to the fellowship an experimental service plan or service structure. Now, Bill was able to say that the traditions were written based on experience of what had worked and what had not worked. He was able to say the steps were written based on experience, what had worked and what had not worked. But he couldn't say that about the service structure, because there had never been a service structure. And frankly, they didn't know how it would work. So they asked the fellowship in Cleveland in 1950 to let them use this plan on an experimental basis for 5 years. And they said if we feel the need to change it, we can change it during the usage of it. We will meet together again 5 years from now. If it has worked satisfactorily, we can approve it as a permanent thing, or we can change it, or we can delete it and throw it away. In 1950 in Cleveland, a loving God expressed himself through the group conscience and accepted this service structure on an experimental basis. Thank God they got it done, because shortly thereafter Dr. Bob died. And that left Bill only as the representative of the fellowship itself, if it had not been for the service structure. Now, the service structure set up a thing called the General Service Conference. And we're not going to go through it all, we'll just briefly talk about it. A method whereby in April of each year that we could hold a meeting in New York City and there could be representatives there from the fellowship itself. We know those people today as the delegates to the General Service Conference. Some are here tonight. We have one who is a functioning delegate here tonight named Tim. I think many of you have met him already from the state of California. There may be other sitting delegates here this weekend that I don't know. Is there any here? Tim, you're the only one this time. These delegates were to gather together in New York City in April, representing various different areas of the United States. Now, in the beginning, there was a delegate from every state. There was a delegate from the provinces in Canada, primarily. I really don't know how many there was in the beginning, and it really doesn't make any difference. Probably 50, 52, 53, I don't know. Those delegates represented the fellowship itself, taking the place of Bill and Bob. Also at the General Service Conference, we had this thing called the Board of Trustees who took care of our business for us, who were primarily the policy-making vehicle of AA, who represented us in our business dealings, and who were responsible to AA to see that it functioned properly. By that time, we had also come up with two other companies, simply because we had grown to the point we had to have them. The little bitty office that used to be in New York City that answered all the inquiries, which originally was Ruth Hawk and Bill, had to be expanded to answer more and more and more and more inquiries. And we began to have to hire more people. Well, if you got to do that, you're going to have to start running a company, because you're going to have to pay salaries, you're going to have tax deductions, you're going to have to pay insurance, you're going to have to pay taxes, and to do all that stuff, you've got to be incorporated somewhere. So we incorporated in the state of New York this General Service Office, which today is known as Alcoholics Anonymous World Services. And there we have staff members employed who take care of AA's day-to-day business, who answer all the correspondence from the groups, who answer all the correspondence worldwide. And as a part of AAWS, we have a publishing operation which publishes our own literature and distributes it throughout the world. We own our own publishing company. We do not print it. We hire that done but we publish it and we own it. In that general service office of AAWS, we have an archivist. Frank is here representing, not representing, he's here as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, but Frank is one of the employees up there. He's not here as a paid professional, he's here as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. We pay Frank for his work, just like we would pay anybody else to be an archivist. We pay the staff members for their work just like we would pay anybody else that would have to answer correspondence. We do not pay them for 12-step work. That's an entirely different thing. We have employees who mail out literature. They are paid employees. That's an ongoing business, and it is a legal entity. We also have this thing called the grapevine. And the grapevine is separately incorporated by itself. It has its own staff, its own editors, its own people working there. So really, as I sit here and talk, I'm talking about 4 different entities in AA. I'm talking first about you and I. We are the fellowship. Then I'm talking about the General Service Board, which happens to be made up today of 21 trustees. And then I'm talking about AAWS, which has its own board and its own corporation, and Grapevine, which has its board and corporation, and they are both owned by the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees is more or less a holding company and has oversight authority on those other 2 companies. And the other 2 companies really conduct our business for us. Now, at the General Service Conference, there is a meeting each year, whereas our elected delegates go there, and I think today there's what, Frank, 91? Mm-hmm. And there they are given reports by the Board of Trustees, by the committees and staff out of the 2 separate entities, AAWS and Grapevine. They are shown all the financial matters. They are shown everything that has pertained to AA business for the last year. They are shown a projected budget for the next year. And if there has been any suggested changes in a piece of literature, it has gone through 2 committees, a trustees committee and a delegates committee representing us. If there are to be any other changes made in anything, it goes through committees, brought back to the floor of the General Service Conference for final approval. There is a total of 135 people at the General Service Conference, if they are all there. There's 21 people from the Board of Trustees. There's 24 or something like that from the staff members and directors. There's the 91 delegates, or a total of 135. To change anything, to approve anything, to pass anything, requires a 2/3 majority. Nothing is ever approved without a minimum of a 2/3 majority. 91 of 135 is more than a 2/3 majority. The Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous belongs to the individual members of Alcoholics Anonymous. And through our service structure and through our elected representatives, we display our wishes. We fulfill our authority and our responsibility at that General Service Conference. And it starts at the group level with your election of a General Service representative. And the General Service representatives in a given district come together and form a district committee. And those district committees and these General Service representatives joining together form an area assembly. And the area assembly is there specifically for the purpose of the election of the delegates to the General Service Conference. That's all it was for in the beginning. Its efforts have been expanded in later years for committee work. But your delegate is elected through and from the groups themselves. So when you vote in your meeting on a General Service representative, you're voting on somebody that you're delegating your authority and your responsibility for AA2. And when they vote for DCMs and then they in turn vote for delegates, they are voting for a person to represent your entire area. Florida, you got two areas, one north, one south, and I think it goes up into Alabama? Yeah. Yeah, in the Northwest there's three areas, isn't it? Arkansas just got one. We don't have very many people. Texas has got 4. California's got what, Tim? 4, 5? 5, haven't they? Plenty of drunks out there on the West Coast. New York's got 4, 5? 4. So it's based really on geographical location and the number of people there, the number of AA members, AA population. And then from those officers of the area assembly, you elect your delegate. Now, one of the prevailing things in AA that I've always hated to see happen is that usually the GSR we elect is the one that's not there at the meeting that night. Or he's sicker than hell and we say, let's elect him and that'll make him well. No, all he'll do is make AA sicker than it already is. I think anytime this ever comes up in your group, always try to elect the best possible person you can to serve you. Because they are going to be responsible, and they are the ones that you're asking to do that job, and they may someday be your delegate, and then from delegates come the trustees, at least the majority of them. And there's always a potential that you're electing a trustee when you elect a GSR. So be careful in your consideration. Now, that General Service Conference was set up by a thing called the Charter. We're not going into the Charter at all, because all it does is set those positions up, GSR, DCM, and such. And it tells you who's going to be at the General Service Conference, so on and so forth. The General Service Conference began to operate in 1951, and in 1955 the Fellowship held another international in St. Louis, Missouri. And this service structure had worked so well that Bill represented it to the fellowship, and it was accepted, a loving God expressing himself through the group conscience as the third legacy of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's remained the same since. Now, Bill noticed, though, one thing he didn't like. He had already worked on the emotional sobriety of the individual through the 12 steps. He had already worked on the emotional sobriety of the group through the traditions. But he began to notice a lot of confusion at the General Service Conference about who was in charge of what. Legally, it belongs to the Board of Trustees. Traditionally, it belongs to the fellowship. Legally, the Board of Trustees can do anything they want to. Traditionally, the fellowship can vote them all out of office. So who is in charge? Who does do what? Who has what authority? And who really is responsible? And these things would come up at the General Service Conference, and of course there would be bickering back and forth, and a large waste of time in bickering rather than in doing things constructively to further help Alcoholics Anonymous. So Bill and this Bernard Smith and some other people began to look at another set of principles, spiritual in nature, and he put them out and he numbered them 12 also, and he called them the concepts. And we want to look at them for just a very few minutes just to give you an idea of what the concepts actually are. You got one, John, thing you can use? You're going to have to do some of these. The 12 concepts for world service. Give me my number sheet over there, John. I don't have it. I'm going to get out of this chair. Here, I got one. Here, I'm fine. Now, John, you're going to take my place there, huh? Here.
I'll give you a place like that.
You ready?
Yeah.
Yeah, if that'll fit in my suitcase, I'm going to take it home with me. I like that chair. I think we'll find as we look at these concepts that Bill followed the same pattern. I've never been sure whether Bill recognized he was doing that or not. But it has become so obvious that he did. I think it's always very interesting to look at it. The first concept expresses a problem. Who has concept one? Willie?
Excuse me.
You gonna make it, huh?
I'm going to make it. Concept 1, the final responsibility and the ultimate authority of AA, world service, should always reside in the collective conscience of our whole fellowship. Alcoholics Anonymous has been called an upside-down organization because the ultimate responsibility and the final authority for world services resides with the groups rather than with the trustees of the General Service Board or the General Service Office in New York. We're still up there. We're often called that upside down because the groups are at the top.
In other words, the problem deals with how do the groups maintain, keep, and express their responsibility and their authority for Alcoholics Anonymous itself. The second concept deals with a solution. And I believe Frank has number 2.
Yes. Concept 2. When in 1955 the AA groups confirmed the permanent charter for their General Service Conference, they thereby delegated to the conference complete authority for active maintenance of our world services, and thereby made the conference, excepting for any change in the 12 traditions in Article 12 of the conference charter, the actual voice and effective conscience for our whole society. Bill and Bob, entrusted by the early groups to get the program going and to spread the message, found non-alcoholic friends to help them. They formed the trusteeship and delegated to it the responsibility for finances, the big book, and other literature, public information, the service office, and the AA grapevine. However, as the trustees constantly looked to the co-founders for advice and guidance, and the groups also continued to hold them accountable, it was evident that the leadership should be transferred to the AA groups as a whole. But if the groups were to carry on their primary purpose, they would have to delegate their leadership role to a General Service Conference.
Okay, so it's obvious then the solution to that problem is the General Service Conference. Now then, how are we going to have emotional sobriety, reduce the bickering, and etc. at the General Service Conference? We now have a series of principles which we refer to as interaction, which gives us the proper relationship between these entities we've been discussing, between the board, the corporations, the staff members, and the delegates themselves. Who has concept 3? John?
Joe?
Joe?
Don't forget me.
I thought that was Willie.
As a traditional means of creating and maintaining a clearly defined working relationship between the groups, the conference, the AA General Service Board, and its several service corporations, staff, committees, and executives, and of thus ensuring their effective leadership, it is here suggested that we endow each of these elements of world service with a traditional right of decision. And this spells out how this is operated. It goes on, but this right also means the fellowship must have trust in its servants. If the groups instruct their GSR rather than give them the right of decision, then the area conference is hamstrung. If a GSR instructs the area delegates rather than giving them a right of decision, then the General Service Conference is hamstrung. As Bill points out, our conference delegates are primarily the servants of AA, and they should cast their votes according to the dictates of their own judgments and conscience at that time. And this gives these different groups and the GSR and, the right of decision. To speak for us. In other words, we wouldn't elect a GSR and tell him to go to the meeting and tell him how he should vote for us. In other words, that person should have our right to make up his mind and how to vote on an issue affecting AA as a whole, because he might, while at the meeting, fear other things that go against our opinion, and we should give him that right if we want the best thing done for us.
This is why he's referred to as a trusted servant.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't have sense enough for us to trust him, we never should have elected him in the first place. So we don't send them there instructed. We let them make decisions based upon the information they hear at that particular meeting, wherever it might be. Next concept deals with the right of participation, and that should be John.
Concept 4. Throughout our conference structure, we ought to maintain at all responsible levels a traditional right of participation, taking care that each classification or group of our world servants shall be allowing a vote representation in reasonable proportion to the responsibility that each must discharge. This is the way and means by which they set up that 135 total votes. Delegates have a vote, trustees have a vote, staff workers, directors, grapevine people have a vote. It sort of reinforces the second tradition. There are no second-class citizens in Alcoholics Anonymous, and it says here that no member is placed in ultimate authority over another. We perform our service tasks better when we are sure that we belong, when our participation assures us that we're truly the trusted servants described in Tradition 2.
Right of participation. The next one deals with the right of appeal and petition. Willie?
Throughout our world service structure, a traditional right of appeal ought to prevail, thus assuring us that minority opinion will be heard and that petitions for the redress of personal grievances will be carefully considered. And with just the stating of that, you can imagine how important that is. So many times, we better listen to that minority, let them express their opinions, because sometimes it gives us a whole new idea about how we should approach an issue by listening. So this concept deals with the right of appeal and thus assuring that minority opinion will be heard.
Number 6 deals with the primary administrative responsibility. Right?
Concept 6. On behalf of AA as a whole, our General Service Conference has the principal responsibility for the maintenance of our world services, and it's traditionally has the final decision respecting large matters of general policy and finance. But the conference also recognizes that the chief initiative and the active responsibility in most of these matters should be exercised primarily by the trustee members of the conference when they act among themselves as the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill makes this point that although our objective is always a spiritual one, nevertheless our world service is a large business operation. Indeed, he says, our whole service structure resembles that of a large corporation. And AA groups are the stockholders. The delegates represent them like proxy holders at the annual meeting. The General Service trustees are actually directors of a holding company. And this holding company, the General Service Board, actually owns and controls the two subsidiaries, AA World Services and the AA Grapevine, which carry on the services. This very real analogy makes it clear that, like any other board of directors, our trustees must be given large powers if they are to manage the affairs of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Simply said, we can't do it on a daily basis. Somebody else has to do it for us. Administrative responsibility belongs to the trustees. The next one deals with legal rights of trustees. Joe?
Concept 7. The conference recognizes that the charter and the bylaws of the General Service Conference are legal instruments that the trustees are thereby fully empowered to manage and conduct all the World Service affairs of Alcoholics Anonymous. It is further understood that the conference chart itself is not a legal document, that it relies instead upon the force of tradition and the power of the AA purse for final effectiveness. Now, this, gives the right of the power of running our business to the trustees. The conference recommends, though its recommendations have the force of directors to the board. The board executes these recommendations. The board does not have the legal authority to veto a conference recommendation, but it acts a practice it never has done so. This board has the right to. They do own the business, but as we say, they follow the recommendation of the conference, and they have never failed to do this. And also, it gives us the power of the purse. Now, if they did decide to take over and run the business as they chose it, then we could quit sending them money, and then they'd go out of business. So we still have the right at the end, the power of the purse.
That's one reason we want to be sure that AA always remains self-supporting through its own contributions from its group members. Because as long as we pay the piper, we'll call the tune. But if the trustees make the money from another source, then they could start calling the tune if they wanted to. Probably that would never happen. But as long as we have the power of the purse, there's no way that could happen. I really can't see the 21 trustees ever getting together for a majority of anything anyhow. 14 of them are alcoholics. The next one is number 8, direct managers of overall finance and policy. John?
Concept 8. The trustees of the General Service Board act in two primary capacities. A, with respect to the larger matters of overall policy and finance, they are the principal planners and administrators. They and their primary committees directly manage these affairs. B, but with respect to our separately incorporated and constantly active services, the relations of the trustees is mainly that of full stock ownership and of custodial oversight, which they exercise through their ability to elect all directors of these entities. I personally think that speaks well for itself.
Very good. Number 9 deals with good personal leadership. Tell him, Willie, what it is.
Yeah, I'm going to tell John what it is. Good service leaders, together with sound and appropriate methods of choosing them, are at all levels indispensable for our future functioning and safety. The primary world service leadership, once exercised by the founders of AA, must necessarily be assumed by the trustees of the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous. This goes right back to the idea of watching who we send towards the top. Because good leadership will also remember that a fine plan or idea can come from anybody, anywhere. Consequently, good leadership will often discard its own cherished plans for others that are better, and it will give credit to the source.
Thank you, Willie. The next one deals with the service authority equals service responsibility. Number 10, Frank.
Hi. By the way, I'm reading out of something called the 12 Concepts for World Service Illustrated. It condenses the concepts, which is the full essays, of course, are in your service manual. I'm sure you know it. Concept 10. Every service responsibility should be matched by
What's a service, man?
I always say the obvious. Yeah. Every service responsibility should be matched by an equal service authority. The scope of such authority to be always well defined, whether by tradition, by resolution, or by specific job description, or by appropriate charters and bylaws. It is perfectly clear, says Bill, that when designated authority is operating well, it should not be constantly interfered with. Otherwise, he warns, those charged with operating responsibly will become demoralized. For example, the General Service Board owns the 2 operating corporations and has authority over, and its authority over them is absolute. Nevertheless, so long as things go well, it is highly important that the trustees do not necessarily interfere with or usurp the operating authority of these entities. To sum up, Let us always be sure that there is an abundance of final and ultimate authority to correct or to reorganize. But let us be equally sure that all our trusted servants have a clearly defined and adequate authority to do their daily work and to discharge their clear responsibilities.
The next one deals with a description of primary committees. Joe?
Concept 11. While the trustees hold the final responsibility for the AA service administration, they should always have the assistance of the best possible standing committees and corporate service directors, executive staff, and consultants. Therefore, the composition of these underlying committees and service boards, the personnel qualifications of their members, the manner of their induction into service, and the system of their rotation, the way in which they relate to each other, the special rights and duties of the executive staff and consultants together with proper basis for a financial compensation of these workers will all be matters of serious concern. And this has to do with having the right things at hand to do the job. Leadership, executive leadership, paid workers, it goes on. No service can function well unless it has sustained by competent executive direction. This must be always head up in one person, supported by such assistance as he needed. That person has to have ample freedom and authority to do his job, and he should not be a figurehead as long as his work is done well. And this, paid workers, how compensated? We only get what we pay for. And so we want the best, and it means to pay those people. Rotation of staff members. This is covered. And full participation of these people in the decision making. If a person works in the General Service Office, he's a part of that conference because he's in there every day, and when the decision's made, he has some day-to-day information that he's gathered day-to-day for his job that should input to the total conference their final decision.
I think we can begin to see that the whole makeup of that General Service Conference is so that we can always get the best results we can possibly get. The 21 trustees, they look at this thing from a slightly different angle. They are the owners with the administrative responsibility. The staff members, the directors of the two companies, AWS and Grapevine, they're on the firing line every day. And they see AA in an entirely different way, things that other people don't see about AA. Then we, as the individual AA members out here in the boondocks, we're still seeing things differently, sometimes than they are. So by bringing all these experiences together at the General Service Conference, and by trying to be sure that it runs the best it possibly can, then surely we can make the proper decisions necessary to ensure our society in the future. Now, the 12th concept, which we believe to be the result of these concepts 3 through 11, this interaction between the trustees, staff, directors, committees, delegates, etc., will be called out in concept 12. And that is the general warranties of the conference. In all its proceedings, the General Service Conference shall observe the spirit of the AA tradition, taking great care that the conference never becomes the seat of perilous wealth or power, that sufficient operating funds plus an ample reserve be its prudent financial principle, that none of the conference members should ever be placed in a position of unqualified authority over any of the others, that all important decisions be reached by discussion, vote, and whenever possible by substantial unanimity, that no conference action ever be personally punitive or an incitement to public controversy, that though the conference may act for the service of Alcoholics Anonymous, it shall never perform any acts of government, and that, like the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous which it serves, The conference itself will always remain democratic in thought and action. Now, surely, if we followed that interaction in those concepts 3 through 11, then these warranties could be met. The General Service Conference has the authority to conduct any of AA's business and do anything that AA needs or wants, except for about 3 things. Number 1, the General Service Conference cannot change a word in the first legacy, the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Number 2, the General Service Conference cannot change a word in the second legacy, the traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. Number 3, the General Service Conference cannot change Article 12 of the conference, which is the warranties which make up the 12th concept of Alcoholics Anonymous. Anything else they can do. The only way those 3 things can be changed is by a 3/4 approving vote of all the groups of Alcoholics Anonymous in the entire world.
No. That's the whole idea, Joe.
They are not chiseled in concrete, but they are damn close to it, I'll guarantee. We've talked about 36 principles. Now, one thing I think we need to make clear and understand fully. The first set of principles, first legacy, 12 steps. Second set of principles, second legacy, tradition. Third set of principles are to be found in the 12 parts of the General Service Conference, or the General Service Charter. That is the service legacy. These concepts are not the third service legacy. They are a set of guidelines to guide us at the General Service Conference. The conference charter is the third legacy charter, the thing called service. Thank you all for being here tonight. Hope to see you tomorrow.